as it turns out, the blue light from your smartphone, especially in an otherwise low light environment like browsing before you go to bed, like none of us would ever do because we've been told it's bad for us, is actually quite bad for you. Researchers at the University College London have actually described it as being toxic. That's a little bit of a buzzword, but apparently the blue light, which is predominant in the LED screens of our phones, does not have enough mix of red and other frequencies, and when your cells get exposed to this, what happens is it slightly impairs the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cells, affecting your blood sugar levels and blood sugar regulation, thus affecting your aging process over a long enough period of time. It could even make you somewhat more prone to diabetes, according to these researchers. And they talk about how natural sunlight has a whole mix of wavelengths and spectrums, whereas this is just solid blue straight to your face. I can't believe it impacts you at a cellular level. These are blue light blocking gaming glasses, so I'm surprised. I guess I've been using them for a long time. But they say the best way to minimize the impact of this is to use the night mode feature, which minimizes blue light exposure. It makes the phone much more red and glowing and a more natural balance of light. I prefer the little glasses, but it's whatever. You can do whatever you want. And in general, you probably just shouldn't be browsing your phone all night before going to bed, but the reality is that almost all of us do, so I'm not going to sit on my high horse and lecture you about that. I have like a little hook that comes down over my head, and I lay on my back like this and watch Twitch until I fall asleep, which is probably not a healthy habit, but we all do love our smartphones. I think the real way forward here is just to use the night mode more often so that it's a little less hard on your eyes and the rest of your body. You get eye strain, it messes up your sleep, and now apparently the powerhouse of your cells are taking L's as well because blue light is just that bad. A man in England is suing Apple after his wife discovers cheating via messages synced to iMac after he deleted them from his iPhone but forgot about the message syncing feature. So he says that he lost over £5 million in a divorce that began after his wife discovered messages that he'd been sending to sex workers. Now, what's interesting about this is that instead of taking any personal responsibility whatsoever, he seems to have just decided to sue Apple instead, and seems kind of upset at his wife for being able to see these messages, because if you have an Apple device, you might know you can delete messages off your phone, but the messages sync to other devices, so you would need to delete them there as well. Well, this guy says basically that's false advertising, that's misleading, that feature caused me to live my life a different way, which ultimately caused me injury, even if I was doing something wrong. And he argues for his wife, it was a very brutal way of finding out. My thoughts are, if I had been able to talk to her rationally and she had not had such a brutal realization of it being talking to sex workers, I might still be married. No, I can't imagine that your wife would see you sending messages to sex workers and say, yeah, there's a really rational, reasonable explanation for that and everything's going to be fine. No, absolutely not. What's interesting is he also wants to establish a class action lawsuit for other men who don't know how to work their phones due to lack of integration, introspection, whatever. Apple did not respond for a comment, obviously. And for those of you that do want to keep your messages more privately, just go to your iCloud settings and turn off messages in iCloud, and then they really should not sync. And that's all you have to do. So I think he's just mad at Apple because he's not very tech savvy. For the first time ever, a 3D printed engine has made it to space. What's even more impressive is that this was by an Indian tech startup that wants to be a lower cost alternative to SpaceX, and they accomplished several other firsts on the flight, such as being the first engine to be 3D printed in a single piece. They didn't just print the components and put them together. The engine was printed in its entirety as little as 72 hours before launch, showing how additive manufacturing could enable on-demand launches for the small company, or relatively small company. So it's a Chennai-based startup called Agnol Cosmos, and they've successfully conducted some suborbital test launches of its rockets, and what they want to do is not carry people to space, but rather to carry various payloads, satellites, pieces of technology, things like that. We do have this lovely video of the launch taking place, and I think this is incredibly cool that they managed to do this on such a small budget with several technological firsts, which I actually skipped. We're going to go back to just as soon as we watch this missile take off into the sky. Everybody's super stoked about it. There it goes off into space. So on top of that being a first, it was the country's first inaugural rocket launch by a privately owned facility, as well as the first one powered by a semi-cryogenic engine, on top of it being a 3D printed single piece engine. So I think this is extremely impressive. This is the kind of low cost approach that the world needs for getting to space, at least for most things. And I love that it's on demand. This is a story you can tell I'm gushing about because of how much more affordable it just made space travel. Nearly all major car companies are actively sabotaging the transition to electric vehicles, and among them, Japanese companies tend to be the worst. This was a very surprising article because I initially thought automakers were embracing EVs, but as it turns out, that may be a little bit of lip service. Now, this is a little bit of a conspiracy video, so I think it's very important we put the tinfoil hat on as we move into conjecture realm here. But let's talk about what happened. This was a new report published called Automakers and Climate Policy that shows that they are actively sabotaging the world's effort to avoid global warming. One of the big things that's going on here is that the industry's own EV forecasts are failing to meet the International Energy Agency's 1.5C warming scenario of a 66% EV market share by 2030, which I got to admit is pretty generous. On top of that, they've also been lobbying to roll back restrictions on pollutions, to weaken EV incentives, basically anything to keep the status quo. And when you take a look at these adoption rates here, of course, you see Tesla 100% electric, absolutely killing it. Mercedes, BMW doing pretty good. And then after that, Volkswagen's getting close, Ford's trying a little bit, but then everything, especially most of the Korean and Japanese brands, it just falls off the charts here. And this isn't the actual sales right now. This is the industry forecast. And all industries have to hit this bar in order to prevent catastrophic warming. We're going to get bad warming, but this is to prevent catastrophe. And when they rated them based on their climate policy, as in what they're lobbying for, really only Tesla is lobbying for green stuff, and the rest of these guys are lobbying for maintaining the status quo, including, as the article points out, yep, they oppose, climate industry groups oppose most climate legislation, we know that, but growing SUV sales are also responsible for increasing transport emissions because SUVs are an extremely popular part of the market right now. Their sales are growing. Honestly, their profit margins are growing too because the vehicles just keep getting bigger and bigger. And if I'm not mistaken on this one, I don't believe this article talks about it, but SUVs are regulated differently than regular vehicles in terms of fuel efficiency. So instead of building more fuel efficient engines, they can just build more SUVs and kind of get around all of that. So it's a little bit of a conspiracy. This is hardly a full fact, but it's somewhat depressing to think that all the car companies that ran their mouth about wanting to swap to EV were just doing that for, I guess, brownie points, clout, but were actively trying to sabotage their own EV transition and pretty much against any type of climate change regulation as well.